All right, it looks like everybody who has tried to log in has logged in. So good morning. Today is July 20, 2023. It's just after 9 a.m. I gotta make sure I got this right. My name is Alan Lilly, Senior Hearing Officer with the State Water Resources Control Board's Administrative Hearings Office. And this is the proceeding by my office and the court's reference to the State Water Board in Monterey County, I'll try again. Monterey County Superior Court. It's case City of Marina versus RMC Lonestar, number 20 CV 00. I don't have it right in front of me. I think it's 1387, if I can remember. And as I say, I'm Alan Lilly. I'm sorry I'm a little late and a little disorganized, but I will get up to speed here. I did have some issues with family medical care I had to deal with this morning, so I apologize for the delay. With that, I will ask for the appearances, just so we have it on the record. I know we do this every day. I guess I'll first state from my office, we have Nicole Kinsey, presiding hearing officer, Skylar Anderson, Kyle Woldridge, and Nicole Mullen, and then Regina Graziano from the State Water Board's Office of Research Planning and Performance. And with that, Mr. Osias, please state your name and enter. I know we all know each other, but I just want the record to be clear each day. So let's do this. So please state your appearance and those of your colleagues and witnesses for California American Water Company.
Thank you, Mr. Lilly, and best wishes for your family member. David Osias of Allen Matkins on behalf of CalAm, also from Allen Matkins, Michael Betts, from Ellison Schneider, Robert Donlin, from CalAm, Catherine Horning. I also observe online Mr. Leffler, Mr. Durbin, and Dr. Ye are observing. I believe that is our group for today.
Okay, thank you. And just for the record, we all refer to California American Water Company as CalAm. And for Marina Coast Water District, Mr. Brochard, please go ahead and state your appearance and those of your colleagues and witnesses.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Lilly. Also on the line, Kyle Brochard of Richards, Watson, and Gershon from Marina Coast Water District. Also on the line is Christina Berglund of Remy Moosit Vanley and Ruth Stoner Muzine of Friedman and Springwater. Mr. Wilkins is traveling. He's going to try and join us, but he's currently having some issues getting signed on. Dr. Kincaid is with us and we're ready to testify today, and so is Ms. Vera Nelson.
Okay, great. Thank you. And good morning to all of you. All right, for City of Marina.
Good morning, Mr. Lilly. Skip Spalding and Larissa Meisenheimer for the City of Marina. We also have our expert, Dr. Mark Trudell, and our legal assistant listening in, Chris Bergman.
All right, and good morning to all of you. And then for RMC Pacific Materials.
Good morning, everybody. James Neudecker for RMC Pacific Materials.
Okay, and good morning, Mr. Neudecker. So today will be something of a mirror image of our proceeding from yesterday. Obviously, we heard a lot from the CalAm witnesses, including a lot of criticisms of the Marina Coast modeling work. So I will certainly be very interested to hear from Dr. Kincaid and Ms. Nelson today. I did have one housekeeping matter that I wanted to talk about first. And I was checking our exhibit files last night, and I think there's an issue here. We have exhibit MCWD 149 is Dr. Kincaid's expert report and appendices. And then we have exhibit 149 revised, which is, I'll pull it up here. It's something completely different.
I can address that, Mr. Lilly.
Okay, good.
There's two exhibits.
I wonder, go ahead.
Yeah, so yes, the first one is exhibit 149, which is Dr. Kincaid's report And then following the report, there is a number of figures, I think 1 to 20, and then there was an appendix that was attached to the back of that. The revised 149 that was submitted was just a revision of the appendix, which I think starts on page 50.
All
And-
right. Well, I
Yeah.
guess if I'd read it more carefully, I would have figured that out, but thank you. And
That's-
what we will do then, just so, I mean, we try to keep our records as clear as we can, obviously. So I will ask Mr. Anderson, not right away, but Mr. Anderson, whenever you have a chance, let's just change the label of that second one to be MCWD 149 revised, and then add the word appendices. So we'll just say revised appendices. Will that be accurate, more or less accurate, Mr. Burchard?
Yes.
Okay, and it will certainly help people like me understand what's going on. Thank you.
And then there's a similar issue with a second exhibit.
Which one is that?
Exhibit 131.
Again, MCWD 131?
Yes, and those were appendices to Ms. Nelson's report. The initial 131 was Appendix C to Appendix I. And then there was a revised 131 that was submitted. That was just revisions to Appendix D to Appendix I. We mistakenly didn't include the Appendix C in the revision. So,
Okay, let me just pull that up here, and then I'm going to just work with you to make sure we get the right label. Okay, so we have 130 MCW 131 revised. What should we call it instead of just revised? What's the most accurate thing to call that?
provide Appendix D to I.
Okay. For some reason it's not, I don't know, maybe rename. Okay, I'm going to just do it right. So just revised, and it's called Appendix D, D as in dog,
Correct.
to, is that
I.
to Appendix I?
To Appendix I is in igloo.
Okay, so I've written 131 revised Appendix D to Appendix I. Is that good?
Yes.
Okay. It's always dangerous when I do this, but I think I got that right. I do see 129 is also revised. Is that just the entire exhibit was revised?
I believe that's fine. Yes.
Okay, let me know. And
Yeah,
Mr.
those
Anderson.
cross sections. That's fine.
Okay, good. And Mr. Anderson has already corrected the one MCWD 149 revised. So thank you.
And then I emailed to everyone this morning and I uploaded a revised exhibit MCWD 141. 141 was it was an email from the water board to Mr. Leffler, Ms. Nelson, and some others. There was a report attached to it. In the initial exhibit, you could click on the attachment and access the report, but the report itself was not printed, the exhibit, so it's a little clunky if you want to cite it. So I just attached the report to the exhibit and submitted a revised one, and I circulated that this morning.
Okay, and that is good. We try really hard to avoid email links in our administrative record for the simple, obvious reason that those links can change over time or basically become inactive over time. So we try to have standalone files in our record. And I think from what you said, Mr. Burchard, you did with the revised, you have done just that.
I did.
So, okay. So Mr. Anderson, at the appropriate time, please just process that. And of course, none of these have been admitted yet, but we'll get them in the record. And then at the appropriate time, Mr. Burchard, if you want, you may offer those into evidence. And of course, Cal-Am may object, but we'll go one step at a time. So thank you for doing that. So,
Mr.
go ahead,
Lee, I
Mr.
have one housekeeping also, just
Go ahead.
you had asked about a table of all the calibration wells that you hadn't found in Cal-Am folders, and asked
Yes.
and we said the material was in the Vista files and we created. So 2 updates for you on that question. Table 1 to Cal-Am 141 is a table of all of the wells used in calibration. And it includes the state well number, X and Y coordinates, the layer, the head, the calibrated head, and the residual. So I think it's missing maybe 1 or 2 items and columns that you had included in your list. So we'll update it and we can have that updated by Monday.
Okay, that'll be fine. I'm going to, and that, so just go ahead and do that. And of course, you know the drill.
Yeah.
Upload it, send an email to the AHO with CCs to everyone else explaining what it is. And then we will transfer it over and advise the parties. What I'm going to do is I'm going to work with my staff, and we'll prepare a post-hearing order, which is going to list the additional exhibits that we want the parties to file. So if you want to go ahead and do this, then you won't be in the order. But there's getting to be, I mean, it's not a huge number, but there are a fair number of things. And so, obviously, if we write it out, that'll help everyone follow it. I know I mentioned yesterday, I think it was Mr. Leffler, either Mr. Leffler or Dr. A or both, basically criticized us for asking for comparisons of the B, C, and D1 scenarios to A1, correctly pointing out that the proper comparison is really C1 to B1 and D1 to B1. So having pointed that out, now we're going to ask, you pointed that out, now we're going to ask for the updated files. But I think the easiest thing is for us to just prepare a list of that. And I did notice in reviewing Ms. Nelson's report that some of those model runs for the B, C, and D scenarios had not been completed. So I will ask them to complete those as well. I mean, clearly what we want is, I try to use the phrase apple to apples comparisons, but we'd like each party's outputs for their modeling of C1 compared to B1, D1 compared to B1, and then of course C2 and C3 compared to C1. I should start out B2 and B3 compared to B1, C2 and C3 compared to C1, and D2 and D3 compared to D1. I'm pretty sure those are the comparisons we want. I don't think we need a comparison of C2 or D2 to B2 or C3 or D3 to B3, but I will check with my staff to make sure about that. So at the end of the day, what we want to be able to report to the court is, here are the differences in the model assumptions. And I think you've all explained those very well. But then also, here are the differences in the model results. And obviously for that part of the report to the court, we want to make sure we're having the same information when, here's what CalAm says and here's what MCWD says. And then just as a word for the wise, please be very careful in futures when you say this is the output of scenario A3, that's fine if it's the output of scenario A3, which sometimes it is, I think, particularly for some of the particle tracking. But if it's a comparison of here's the difference in the output for A3 compared to A1, or more importantly, B3 compared to B1, please make sure to say that too. I think there's sometimes where in shorthand, it just says here's B3, when what it really means is B3 minus B1. So you all understand it, but so we can understand it and the board members and the court can understand it. Please be very, very careful to make sure you're describing when it's a comparison of two scenarios and when it's just a scenario. And we'll try, I know I've asked Mr. Woldridge, please make a note of this and we'll try to put this in our order as well. But we're getting there and this has been very valuable. I don't know if the court will ever understand why it has taken us as long as it has, but I think in one of Mr. Leffler's slides yesterday noted this, I think it was about slide 4 early on, about how much we have accomplished or how much has you all have accomplished in the last 6 months. So I think we really have accomplished a lot. We just have to synthesize it so it's in a usable format. So anyway, I'll stop talking. Anything else, or can we go ahead and get started with Dr. Kincaid? All right. So my plan is, as for yesterday, to allow 45 minutes for Dr. Kincaid to summarize his slides, 45 minutes for Ms. Nelson to summarize her slides. If there needs to be a little trade-off, a little more for one witness and a little less for the other, that's okay. And of course, if I interrupt with questions, then that doesn't count against the 45 minutes. So with that, let me just pull together. First of all, Dr. Kincaid, good morning. And go off mute. There you go.
Good morning. Good morning, Mr. Lilly.
And as a reminder, you still are under the oath you took in the prior round of the hearings.
Yes, sir.
And I'm going to just do the preliminaries. Is Exhibit MCWD 127 your supplemental direct testimony for this proceeding?
I trust that remain unfamiliar with all the numbers, but I trust that it is. Otherwise,
I'll tell you,
Mr. Brochard would jump and say otherwise.
He would. It says supplemental direct testimony of Todd Kincaid, PhD. I
Yes,
just want
that
you
sounds
to
good.
authenticate.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. And then is exhibit, get the other number here. Is exhibit MCWD 151 your rebuttal testimony to rebuttal to Mr. Durbin for this phase of the proceeding?
Yes, sir.
And Mr. Brochard's listening carefully. And is exhibit MCWD 154 your rebuttal testimony for the remainder of this proceeding besides your rebuttal to Mr. Durbin?
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you. And as I've said before, by authenticating those exhibits, you're also authenticating all the technical reports and memorandum that are cross-referenced in them. And then finally, we will turn and I will ask Ms. Mullen to display exhibit MCWD 161, which I'll just ask you to confirm once it's up, if that is in fact your summary slides for this phase of the proceeding. So is Dr. Kincaid, is this exhibit MCWD 161 your summary slides for this phase of the proceeding?
Yes, sir. I believe it is.
Okay. So with that, why don't you go ahead? You know how to pace yourself. I see here you have, looks like 52 slides. So
Yes, sir.
a little faster than one per minute.
I'm going to skip some of these and try my best to go through them very quickly.
Yeah, I just I want to be fair to all, or equal treatment to all parties. So I will hold you to 45 minutes. I have down 9:23 right now. So why don't you just proceed with your summary?
Thank you, sir. Could you turn to slide 49, please?
Okay, that's moving right along.
Yeah, we're almost done.
I'm just kidding. Go ahead. Ms. Mullen will do that. Okay, go ahead.
I have a different, because of the title. Could you go to slide 50, please? Yes. That is.
Okay, so just for the record, we have on the screen now exhibit MCWD 161, slide 50. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, so I'm going to jump right into the meat of this. I think everybody knows who I am by now. This slide and the next one compare real world water levels in the upper 180-foot aquifer with what they will look like after being lowered by the drawdown predicted by the MCWD and the CalAm versions of the Water Board Steady State Model 2023, which I think from now on I'll just call the model. The color flood, the colors from blue to red, depict water level elevations. The shades of red mark areas interpreted to be elevations below 0 feet elevation. The shades of yellow to the first light blue are areas between 0 and less than 1 foot below mean sea level, as reported to be in Monterey Bay. The darker shades of blue are areas above mean sea level. The dashed lines are the aquifer subbasin boundaries. The leftmost of the dashed lines marks the shoreline. Please disregard the red circles. Those are holdovers that I didn't get omitted before submitted these. And the red arrows, though, mark the direction of groundwater flow, or essentially the down gradient direction between the area of higher elevation, groundwater elevations along the coast and the MCWD monitoring wells, or MCWD water supply wells. The map on the left depicts groundwater surface, the groundwater surface as interpreted from groundwater elevation data measured in spring of 2021. The map on the right depicts groundwater elevations that are predicted to occur after being lowered due to drawdown from the proposed slant wells operating at proposed at the rate of 15.5 MGD, as predicted in this case by MCWD's version of the model. And after explaining all this, what I want to draw your attention to is the reduction in the size of the yellow and blue regions. So not only the reduction in the spatial extent of the yellow and blue regions, but the reduction in the overall magnitude as reflected by the darkest blue areas reflected on the map. Could you go to the next slide, slide 51?
And just before we do, just to clarify, is the left picture basically the output of MCWD's model for scenario 1A, and the right slide the output for scenario 3A?
No, sir. The left side is an interpretation or an interpolation of actual data points, which I omitted by mistake from this map, but I have a revised figure that that shows the location of the data points from which this map was generated, and that can be submitted if you would like. But it is a contour map, simply colored so that the colors can be compared. In other words, the data versus the model, data on the left and model on the right. Okay. And in the case of the model, you can see the dark red circle just above the yellow near the coast. That's the drawdown, or that's the pumping depression in the groundwater surface that is predicted to occur due to the slant well pumping. So you can see the location of the proposed project as marked by the depression in the simulated water table surface, or simulated groundwater surface in this case, in the upper 180-foot aquifer. So again, the point is data model.
Is the right figure then the output from scenario 3A?
The right figure, I believe, is the output from scenario B3 or scenario 3B.
Oh, 3B. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that clarification. Sorry for the interruption. That probably would be good if you submit that map just so we know where the left figure came from.
Okay.
So Mr. Brochard can work with you on that. Anyway, go ahead. Excuse me for my interruptions.
No problem. Could we go to the next slide, slide number 51?
And I just want to make a note. You said it's 3B output was the right figure. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so on this slide, essentially the only thing that's changed is we're showing the predicted drawdown that we derived from CalAM's model, same scenario. So, and if you toggle back and forth a couple times, in other words, if you go back to slide 50 and then immediately back to slide 51, you'll see essentially the difference in the two model predictions with regard to how the drawdown will affect the mound of fresh water that is situated in the upper 180-foot aquifer near the shoreline. And so now I think we're still on slide 51.
Yes, this is slide 51.
The reason I start with this is that there has been question about the definition of harm. What is harm? What is not harm? And what I intend to point out in my presentation today is the interpretation, or our interpretation of harm, which is a reduction in protective head, which is harm. And these maps depict our conceptualization, or what we define to be protective head, which is quite simply the mound of fresh water that exists along the shoreline that is above sea level and currently inhibits or prevents seawater intrusion from entering the upper 180-foot aquifer in the Monterey subbasin And in this case, you can see that drawdown will reduce those protective heads, not only across the northern to central portion of the Monterey subbasin, but also in the southern portion of the 184 400-foot subbasin. Another form of harm is seawater intrusion that is not captured. It exacerbates an existing problem and it reduces water quality. Another harm is a loss of storage in the unconfined water table aquifers, including the DSA. Another harm is increased cross-boundary flows that reduce the quantity of water that is available to existing users in the Monterey subbasin. Another form of harm, or not another form of harm, but what I would like you to do is now, as we move forward, is always to consider the predicted magnitudes of seawater intrusion and flows that are talked about so often throughout both our presentations in the context of the pumping that is occurring at MCWD's wells, which is about 3,500 acre feet per year. So in essence, Marina Coast Water District pumping wells are very close to a situation in which they're no longer able to operate. So there's great concern over any incremental or what we might otherwise sometimes call cumulative impacts that could reduce in any way the protective heads that are currently helping or there to keep, that are the reason that there is fresh water in the upper 180-foot aquifer and portions of the 400-foot aquifer that from which Marina Coast Water District is drawing water. So with this, could we go back to slide 1? And
okay, before we
yes.
do, just again, apologize for the interruptions, but I want to make sure I understand.
Of course.
So the left figure in slide 51, is it the exact same as the left figure in slide 50?
Yes, sir. It's still the data.
Okay, and then the right figure, is this now the CalAm model scenario 3B output?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. I thought so. I just want to make sure. And with that, Ms. Mullen, please go back to slide 1.
I'm sorry. Slide 1. There we go.
Okay, I think this is actually slide 2.
Should be slide 2. Yes, I apologize. I will endeavor not to make that mistake. Okay, these maps depict capture zones as delineated from backward particle tracking. In this case, the name says it all. It's not more complicated than that. A capture zone, regardless of gradient, defines the area from which wells derive their water. There are 2 basic sources depicted here: the ocean and in some combination of inland sources. The results I'll be describing are based on, in our case, also to be clear, the results I'm going to be talking about from this point forward until I break it out will come from the version of our model that has the distribution of pumping established at 19% from the DSA and 81% from the lower 180-foot aquifers. So before we get into that, I want to talk about this distribution of pumping. So assigning a 44-56% split in the pumping in our model is not the correct way to simulate pumping from our model, based on our conceptual simulation of the hydrostratigraphic unit thicknesses, hydraulic conductivities, which combined are a way to define the layer transmissivities. The correct way to do this is, as you suggested yesterday, which is essentially based on the distribution of thicknesses in the layers from which the pumping will occur. And those thicknesses are, of course, built into the model design. And so to most accurately reflect what each model would say about the impacts of pumping, they should be defined on the basis of how those models, respective models, define those layer thicknesses and hydraulic conductivities. That said, I directed my team to use the 44-56 split, which deviates from the appropriate methodology, specifically so that we could try to generate an apples to apples comparison, which is what I agreed to do as best I could to deliver for you. The problem is that my team didn't really do what I said in this case, and they went ahead and did what should be done and split it out on the basis of transmissivity, which comes out to about 19% from the DSA, 25% from the combination of the lower DSA and the upper 180-foot aquifer. And then the remainder from the remaining 56% from the lower 180-foot aquifer. When I went back and calculated the transmissivities by my read of the layer thicknesses, a quick query before this presentation, I come out with 19.7 to the DSA, 29.6 to the lower DSA, upper 180-foot combination, and 50.6 from the lower 180-foot aquifer. So from my perspective, my team actually did what a good hydrogeologist should do, despite the fact that I asked them to do something different in order to facilitate a direct comparison. So I apologize for that. I told you I would try to do this, and I thought I did, but it didn't. And with that said, I have asked them to run, and they have run the model comparisons using a specified 44-56 split. And we've submitted the results of those as a revised set of figures that I believe came to you last night.
Okay, and I think that's, Mr. Anderson, is that what you've labeled as MCWD 161? He may still be
Let me double check.
just trying to keep our record clear.
I think it's 162.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Mr. Brochard. So the revised figures are 162. And then again, Dr. Kincaid, when you say, I'm writing this all down, 44-56, of the 44, how much comes from the what you call the upper DSA, and how much is from the lower DSA and upper 180?
The 44% is from the DSA.
Okay.
And the 56% is then distributed to the layers that include in our model, the lower dune sand aquifer, which is very thin, the upper 180-foot aquifer, and then the lower 180-foot aquifer.
Okay, and I don't know if it's important, but can you tell me the split among those three of that 56%?
We've lumped, and I'm going to talk about this later, we've lumped the lower DSA and the upper 180-foot aquifers together. And those, I don't have, actually, I'm sorry, I don't have those numbers at my fingertips, but I can get those to you. Okay,
we'll have to kind of see how we're going to sort this all out. But anyway, go ahead. I apologize for interrupting.
That's okay. In reality, the distribution that's going to occur when the pumps are turned on cannot really be known with certainty, because we can't really know exactly what's going to take place, what's happening in the subsurface. I advocated initially that we would use the multi-well node package and a finer grid spacing to accomplish these simulations, but that suggestion was rejected by Cal-Am. And so I didn't think that it would be that big of a deal. And again, I assumed we'd be assigning these the same way, so it shouldn't be a difference. But I'll discuss the difference as we move forward to my presentation. So with that said, can we move to slide 3, please?
And just again, something I was wondering about when I saw this yesterday, can you explain to me why there's that little blue line in the left figure that goes kind of from the larger blue area down to just to the left of MCWD 29? And then in the right figure, there's a little green line which goes straight down. What is going on with those? If you can explain what the model is doing here.
I think I can, sir. And if we just step to the next slide, it's actually a duplicate of this one, but it'll provide another answer.
Okay, go ahead. I apologize.
No problem. So what we're looking at are reverse particle tracks from a rectangle established of starting points that surround the pumping wells, and then tracking those particles backward to their point of origination. So in our model, on both models, you can see that some go to the ocean. And in our model, you can see that the inland source values go only to the dune sand aquifer. They go to the east and then south, which is effectively climbing up to the very top of the dune sand aquifer. The point of origination is the highest point from which recharge is occurring to the dune sand aquifer, and it's essentially an artifact of particle tracking. In reality, flow will come from the area, a progressively narrower area as you move further and further up gradient into the dune sand aquifer. So essentially, as you get closer and closer to the project well, the inland water will come from a wider portion of the dune sand aquifer. And as you go further and further up, it comes from a narrower portion. And that's reflected in both models.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And so essentially what we're showing is both models are showing that the source of water to the freshwater or not seawater is the dune sand aquifer, which in this case would be fresh. And then another source predicted by the CalAm model, which can be seen by the green lines that move off to the Salinas River, is therefore induced river water losses that will occur in the Salinas River. So I bring these up and make a point because CalAm did not present capture zones yesterday. And their claim that the landward component of flow lines should be disregarded on the basis of assumed travel times is, in my opinion, completely unfounded and prevents us from identifying the inland sources of water that their model and our model says will be impacted by slant well pumping. In reality, the computation of travel time can be misleading because it's based on an assignment of and an assumption of effective porosity, which is typically significantly less than porosity. And as effective porosity goes down, the velocity of the water movement goes up and the travel time goes down. So it's very dependent on that assumed quantity that can't really be measured. We've talked about the termination points in the lines. So another rule of thumb I would like to point out is that as the more specific the question you ask of a model, the more assumptions are needed to answer it, and therefore the higher the uncertainty in the answer. And so in this case, by the time you get to travel time, you're getting to a very specific question, and the uncertainty on that is very high. So that's not to say that I would advocate that all of these areas be, viewed with equal weights, but certainly if you want to delineate a capture zone and where the sources of water ultimately are coming from, the utilization of particle tracks to their full extent is perfectly, not only perfectly acceptable, it's a very common practice. So like if I were doing it, we might put a fair bit of effort into trying to quantify time and then break those out by zones. Could we then go to the next slide, slide number 4, please?
Okay, so we now have slide 4 on the screen. Go ahead.
Okay, with slide 4, I want to start out by saying that I agree, and that with the problem with my methodology that Dr. Ye pointed out. The method that I use to estimate the percentage of flow from inland sources is not appropriate because I inadvertently failed to account for the amount of seawater intrusion that's already occurring within the capture zone. So because of that, on the next couple slides, I would ask that you disregard the columns that are highlighted in yellow that mark the percentages of flow from inland sources, and I intend to retract that component of my testimony from both my report and my rebuttal. That said, our water budget analyses do appropriately depict the determination of seawater intrusion that will be induced outside of the capture zone. And that's because I use the word induced. The water budget analyses were designed and intended to represent what changes as a result of the pumping. And so respond to your request, where it says B3, it should really be scenario B3 minus B1, C3 minus C1, and D3 minus D1.
Okay, thank you.
And the other reason that they're can reliably estimate what's happening outside of the capture zone is because, as the name implies, the capture zone as depicted by particle tracking was used to segregate the zone budget analysis into reaches that occur inside and outside of the capture zone. So in this case, our models are showing these relative to the amount of, certainly relative to the amount of pumping occurring by MCWD, significant components of flows that will occur outside of the capture zone, where our particular concern would be with what happens in reaches 1 and 2.
Okay, and before you go on, Dr. Kincaid, Dr. Ye yesterday talked about, I'm sure you were listening, had the numbers at what you have depicted right there on the ocean boundary for these reaches. And then he had 1 mile inland and 2 mile inland, and the numbers went down considerably. And I don't know if you know enough about the details of his calculation to answer this, but on cross-examination, he didn't really have a good answer for what happened to that water.
That's okay. We can.
You have an answer for what happens to this water.
I do, sir. And the water moves from the south to the north into a zone or a reach that for which the water budget analysis wasn't provided. And then it also moves downward into lower layers for which the water budget analysis weren't compiled. The power of the volumetric analysis is that water does not disappear from the model domain. And if the water is flowing outside of the capture zone, as the name implies, it does not get captured. So the fact that the zone budget analysis that he showed that was limited to the upper layers of the model showed a decrease in flow as you move to the east doesn't reflect the fact that it, number one, moved north into an area for which the budget didn't calculate, and then also moved downward into layers for which it didn't reflect either.
Okay, when you say north, I assume you mean the water that the seawater intrusion in reaches 1 and 2.
That's right. It moves up from reach. Well, it moves up in his. I believe it moves up into reach 3, for which the water budget didn't account. In other words, it's flowing up. All of the models are suggesting that flow paths are coming inland to the east southeast and then flowing, curving around to the north.
Okay, thanks.
Yes. Can we go to the next slide?
Okay, and we're now on
That would be slide number 5. And with slide 5, I don't want to say a lot about it other than to say that our models are that intuitively you would think, and I think generally speaking, the models show that if you reduce the magnitude of pumping for the project, the magnitude of the seawater intrusion induced outside of the capture zone, it decreases. The only difference there was in our estimation for scenario C with CalAM's model, which appears to increase as depicted on these tables. It goes, if you compare the table in the last last slide to this one, it appears to go up from 1,871 to 2,081 acre feet per year. And for that, I'm not sure why. Can we go to slide 6?
Okay, we're on.
I'm sorry, slide 9, please.
Okay, we'll just jump forward to slide 9. Go ahead. We have slide 9 on the screen now.
Okay. Sorry, slide 10. I'm gonna.
No, it's fine. I know you're trying to go through quickly, so no need to apologize. We'll have slide 10 on the screen now.
I see that. All right, so slide 10, I just want to go through, try to answer some of the court's questions as best I can. Question number 3, what is the hydrogeological connectivity, if any, between the areas that CalAM's going to pump and the MCWD wells? The regions are hydraulically connected. There are no barriers to lateral flow between these two areas within the respective aquifers. The zones from which CalAM proposes to pump are hydraulically connected to the 400-foot aquifer from which MCWD withdraws a significant portion of its water beyond the southern extent of the 400-foot aquitard and through gaps in the aquitard north of the unit extent boundary. All 3 of the models, by my estimation and interpretation, all 3 of the models used in this investigation now show that the DSA 180-foot and 400-foot aquifers are hydraulically connected in at least some part or parts of the model domain. With respect to question 4, my answer is yes, and we just got done talking about that with respect to the calculation of estimation of seawater intrusion out that's not captured. So Can we move to slide 11, please?
All right, we now have slide 11 on the screen. Go ahead.
So for slide 11, the question asks, is there going to be any lowering of the groundwater table? And I think that's quite obviously yes. And the next few slides will compare the drawdown predicted by both models. In this case, it's comparing the drawdown predicted to occur in our uppermost hydrostratigraphic unit layer. For us, that's layer 1, which we call the water table aquifer DSA. And then for Calium, it's layer 2. The yellow areas shown on these maps depict where the predicted drawdown will be less than half a foot. The first orange area, the orange areas are the areas that I personally focus mostly on. The first orange area is a drawdown of between half a foot and a foot. The second orange area shows a predicted drawdown of between 1 and 5 feet. The yellow circles on this map are MCWD wells that are drawing from the 180 and 400 foot aquifers. The green circles are the wells drawn from the 400 and deep, and the blue circles are the wells drawn from the deep aquifer. So in this case, drawdown in these aquifers constitutes a reduction in storage because these are unconfined aquifers. And I know Ms. Nelson is going to speak to this in her testimony. So could we go on to slide 12? So I'm just going to flip through these and I'll draw your attention to the different interpretations of the two orange lines. Again, the distribution of predicted drawdown that it will exceed a half a foot in the first orange, and the distribution of drawdown that will exceed 1 foot in the darker orange. So this is in the upper 180 foot aquifer. Could you go to the next slide, slide 13?
Okay, we have slide 13 now, or
this is the lower 180 foot aquifer. And then the next slide, slide 14. This is in the 400 foot aquifer. And in this case, the larger impacts predicted by MCWD's model stem from our interpretation of a smaller spatial extent of the 180 foot, 400 foot aquitard, which both I and Ms. Nelson will talk about here shortly.
so, and Dr. Kincaid, while you're going through these, I know there were different versions of the MCWD model, which we've referred to as June 1, June 12, and June 16. Which version of the model are these left-hand figures based on?
These are all based on the scenario models that were submitted on June 16. So
Okay.
These are all showing the results from which the labels are showing B3. But again, to be specific, this is the differential computed by subtracting the heads predicted under B3 from the heads predicted under B1.
Okay, yeah, and that's, as I say, for all of you, please in the future, if you can call that B3 minus B1, I think it's more accurate and
Okay,
easier for me to follow.
we'll make that change. If we could go on to slide 14. And now I'm going to talk about try to address some of the criticisms of our model. Again, I'm sorry, slide 15.
Okay, we have slide 15 now.
Okay, so did our boundary heads change? The answer is yes. Our boundary heads changed between the May 31 and June 12 version. And I know I expressed concern multiple times from the beginning that the fact that these are the regional model, the SVSM, and the local model are different model conceptual constructions, one being a texture model, the SVSM, and one being a layered hydrostratigraphic model conceptualization, and that would almost certainly result in difficulties with the translation of heads from one model to the other. And that's what occurred. After we submitted our model on May 31st, when reviewing our model, we saw that the simulated seawater intrusion to the upper layers, the relevant aquifers in our model, the 180 foot and 400 foot aquifers, were significantly too high. And on exploration of that, we revealed that I had made a mistake in the computation or the calculation on our spreadsheets to convert or translate, I should say, Mr. Durbin's heads to our layers. We corrected that translation methodology, which resulted in new heads along the boundaries, the most significant of which were the southern boundary, which I was focused on because that was the one I believed, or we believed, to be most responsible for the discrepancy in seawater intrusion. And that ended up being why I specified in my explanation that we changed the heads in the southern boundary. So the fact that they also changed significantly less on the other boundaries and I didn't specify that was an oversight on my part. We recalibrated the model using the different heads, using the past calibration or parameter estimation process, as well as manually recalibrated that result to the observed drawdowns, and then submitted that as a new model. And that became the June 12th model. A couple of extra points that aren't written here. We did not follow the specific layer assignments as recommended by Mr. Durbin, specifically with respect to our layer 8, which represents the 400-foot aquifer. And that's because on review of his heads, we saw that there was a difference in the average heads across the layers that he recommended that we use for layer 8. We didn't feel that that would be appropriate for our model, so we came up with a different assignment methodology. But in essence, we still used Mr. Durbin's heads to define boundary conditions for our model, as we agreed to do and as was intended. With regard to the test slant well, and since we're talking a little bit about model calibration here, with regard to the test slant well, I directed my team to apportion the pumping 64% to the DSA and 36% to the 180-foot aquifer, and then a roughly 50-50 split, specifically because that is how it was reported to have occurred by Geoscience in their 2016 technical memorandum, TM2 monitoring well completion report for the CMEX model update. More specifically, it was my understanding through our experts meetings that we agreed to set up the model and calibrate to the test slant well on the basis of their reporting, not only of how the test slant well was operated, but also on the drawdowns. So the fact that we deviated from that is actually by design, and from my perspective was by agreement. The purpose of model calibration, moreover, is to correlate as closely as possible to model simulation to real world conditions as they occurred. And by my read of that TM, it says this is what they believe to have occurred. That's why we put that, assigned those. Now, the fact that they're assigned differently for future wells to be constructed, those are future wells to be constructed. I take that at face value, and I tried to take it at face value, which is the 44-56 split. But so from my perspective, there is absolutely nothing wrong with the methodology that we used for calibration. It conforms 100% to the expectation for calibration and to what I believe that we agreed to in the experts meetings. And frankly, when I read the review, I was pretty shocked to see that we were deviating from that. All right, so can we move to slide 16?
So just so I understand, again, I apologize for interrupting, but this is very important. As I understand it, you made, I'm going to call it a conversion of the heads, the outcome, and if I'm using the wrong term, I apologize, but I think you're saying the boundary condition heads. You determined how you thought Mr. Durbin's model output boundary heads should be converted, but then I'm not hearing that you changed those during your calibration process. Is that correct?
No, we did not change those during the calibration process. Once those heads were assigned, they remained static.
Okay, thank you. I thought that's what you said. I just wanted to make sure. Please go ahead.
So on this slide, let's see. We're on slide 16, is that right?
We're on 15, but we can move to
Okay.
16. Now we're on
Thank
16. Go ahead.
Yeah, no problem. 16. Does our model converge? Categorically, yes. The June 12 version of the model as submitted on June 12 converges as delivered using what are called the complex solver settings for the Newton-Raphson solver. And despite the fact that it's called the complex settings, that's actually the default setting with a maximum iteration count set to 250. So the reality is that as we were working on calibration and working very rapidly, we changed those solver settings to expedite model runs. In reality, the issue with convergence is really to ensure that the imbalance between flows remains at a very low and inconsequential amount. And even though we were running them at a relaxed set of solver settings, we were still getting flow imbalances of less than 1%, which we consider to be more than sufficient for the interim runs we were performing. We did inadvertently leave the solver settings, those custom solver settings established when we delivered the model. But again, if you would use the default settings, the model does converge. Just as a point of comparison, we tested CalAM's model using our solver settings, and it too fails to converge under those specifications. We tested our June 12 model using CalAM solver settings, and our model converges under those specifications. And all of the scenario runs that were submitted do converge with the solver settings that were supplied, which are the default complex solver settings.
So
kind of more irksome to the point is that this could have been solved with a very quick email correspondence between professionals. And instead it turned into a significant amount of work to track down what in essence is a non-issue.
So Dr. Kincaid, and this is something that I've been trying to understand for a long time, and I hope you can, and trust me, this is not counting against your 45 minutes. I'm
That's fine.
keeping track of that, so don't worry about that. But I understand the concept of convergence. I mean, I spent a fair amount of time in math classes, but can you tell me what does the model or what parameters in the model are changed from run to run as the model is attempting to achieve convergence? That I just don't understand that.
The model isn't changing parameters. It's running the model with, and then looking at the heads and then looking at how the model simulates the distribution of both heads and flows. And in particular, it looks at all of the inflows and all of the outflows and the difference between those two. And that we then can describe as the imbalance of flows. In the ideal world, the inflows will exactly meet or equal the outflows. But in reality, the models sometimes don't exactly match. And that tolerance or that acceptable level can actually be specified. So convergence itself can be, you can get a model to converge with a 1% deviation between those inflows and outflows. Or you can say, no, I don't want to consider 1% to be quote unquote convergent. So you can set that to be 0.1% or 0.01% or whatever you feel like is appropriate.
Okay.
So it's
then
quite a bit subjective.
What does the model change from one iteration to the next?
So with every iteration, it has a starting head condition, and then it processes through the finite difference grid, computing head differentials from cell to cell. And then once it passes through, it computes the overall difference, the new distribution of heads and the resulting new distribution of flows. And then it compares those. And if it meets its convergence criteria, it's finished and says it's converged. If it doesn't, then it uses those, the heads that it got from that run as a new starting head, and then it recomputes, it goes back through the grid and recomputes the heads. And what quite often I've found in complex models is that the error between in the model runs will crash or will go down precipitously with the first sets of runs. And then sometimes it'll oscillate at a very low flow differential and then ultimately not converge. And that usually means that there's someplace in your model you have some kind of instability in the way that you've designed the model, or in the way that the model is forced to compute all of the different forces and parameters that have been assigned, or that it's trying to account for in, let's say, for instance, very thin layers. So lots of different types of things can affect how quickly a model converges, whether or not it will converge. In other words, maybe it'll oscillate at a very small imbalance and never reach convergence. Or, sometimes it might take minutes to converge, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but if you're trying to do run after run after run to try to evaluate how your understanding of the overall processes that you're simulating contribute to the model's ability to calibrate, then if the model runs in 3 minutes versus 7 minutes becomes quite significant.
Okay, thank you. That is helpful.
Okay, so I also want to just talk about the recharge. Was our recharge misapplied? No. Recharge was essentially assigned to the uppermost layer in our model to facilitate appropriate simulation of heads in the very thin numerical layers overlying the 400-foot aquifer. And we determined that the loss of recharge in those areas would not likely have a significant effect on the simulated drawdown or capture zones, because the heads in those regions were primarily controlled by the specified head boundaries that in those cases that we got from Mr. Durbin. Can we go to slide 17? Yes.
Okay, we now have slide 17 on the screen.
With respect to ET, is that somehow inappropriate to define ET? No, it is not. Again, from our perception or perspective, recharge is not a known quantity. At best, it has been estimated spatially across the domain by multiple different people. We attempted to use Mr. Durbin's recharge across our model domain. The way that we have conceptualized the relationship between the water table aquifer, which north of the river is very thin, less than 10 feet, and then thinning progressively to the north, combined with the way that we simulated the SVA, means that we were getting too much water in that area and we needed to pull it out. Conceptually, does it make sense that ET would be occurring to a higher degree than was reflected in the recharge values that we see from Mr. Durbin? I think that's entirely plausible. Ms. Nelson will provide more backup for that in her testimony. But essentially what you can see wherever we have ET assigned, by looking at a standard topographic map, you would see that that's quite wet. It's essentially a wetland, which is where you would expect to see a very large amount of ET. That, combined with the fact that it's a very thin water table and it sits on top of the SVA, impedes the ability of water to move vertically downward. The Salinas River, by my read of the available publications, does run on top of the SVA, which impedes the vertical movement of water and recharge into the underlying aquifers. So again, our use of the ET package in no way deviates from a plausible conceptual model. Can we move to slide 18?
Okay, we have slide 18 on the screen now.
Was the river assigned correctly? Yes, I believe the river was assigned correctly. Bottom line again is we wanted to use the information that we got from the regional model, but on inspection, and not surprising, the regional model is, as the name implies, regional. The grid spacing is large. We knew that we would have some trouble using the stream bed conductances that we got from the regional model and our model. So we went and we got data from the Spreckles gauging station, which is the closest upstream gauging station. in an effort to try to better define our stream bed conductances. And in the process of calculating that, we realized that there was a pretty significant discrepancy between what the data says at the Spreckles gauge for our calibration period with respect to the depth of water, which by our calculations is about 1.0076 feet during the model calibration period, and the average stream depth that was applied in the CalAm model, which came from the regional model, which is about 6 feet. So I think because when we saw that, we thought that it would be more appropriate to take the information that we got through our interpretation of the data that is published and available for the Spreckles gauge. Did the horizontal conductivity values near the proposed slant wells change between the June 1 and June 12? Yes, of course they did, because we recalibrated to the boundary conditions that we corrected after finding our mistake. Can we go to slide 19, please?
Okay, we're on slide 19. Go ahead.
Okay, so this one I know is caught your attention, so I want to spend just a little bit of time on this. Why did we use the constant head boundary assignments? From my perspective, the primary purpose of a modeling study is to develop an understanding of the balance of forces that affect groundwater levels and how those levels respond to external operations. In the North Marina area, the controlling forces are quite simply ocean inflows, recharge from the DSA, and inland pumping from the various aquifers. To some degree, all of those things are to varying degrees, all of those are unknown. The position of the constant head boundaries. So I directed my team to change the model structure to use linear constant head boundaries to facilitate a better understanding of how ocean inflows and recharge from the DSA affect heads, particularly near the coastal areas within the time constraints imposed by the proceedings. The position of the constant head boundaries effectively depict our conceptualization of the location in which the respective HSU outcrops at the ocean floor, and thus becomes hydraulically connected to the ocean. The DSA is hydraulically connected to the ocean at the shoreline, which is as you would expect. And pumping, even from the slant wells, will not likely draw the ocean down. So assigning a constant head boundary equal to the ocean head in the water table aquifer where it is hydraulically connected to the ocean is, by my read, pretty defensible. In the 180-foot aquifer, and our conceptualization becomes hydraulically connected to the ocean approximately 1 mile offshore, and in the 400 aquifer becomes hydraulically connected approximately 2 miles offshore. These positions, based on my conceptual understanding of the hydrostratigraphy as it exists offshore, are consistent with what other people have said, with other interpretations, and frankly, are highly uncertain. So it's these positions that we varied during our calibration process, because we could immediately see that where the ocean becomes hydraulically connected to the HSUs has a pretty strong effect on the heads, particularly close to the shoreline. The closer the connection, the higher the more the ocean affects the heads, and therefore the effect was to raise heads in our simulation closer to the calibration targets. But the drawback from that is, as you raise those heads, you also raise the simulated ocean inflows. So in a nutshell, I believe our positions, the positions are very defensible, and they are, as our interpretation, the best balance we could achieve between using them to elevate the heads to try to achieve calibration, but yet keeping the ocean inflow at something that is reasonably consistent with the conceptual guesses about how much ocean inflow is actually occurring.
When you said linear, I wrote down you said linear. What did you mean linear here? I think you said linear head boundaries, right?
Yeah. So when you look at them on a map, we basically assigned a line, not a straight line, but a line that's subparallel to shore, and then actually deviates in the north to conform around the Monterey Trench to reflect the position of those of where those units effectively outcrop and then become hydraulically connected to the ocean.
Okay, so it's geographically linear, not algebraically linear, what you're talking about here.
Yes, sir. Geographically linear.
Sorry, I'm
No, sir. It's can be
learning.
used
Go
both
ahead.
ways.
Go ahead.
In my opinion, our model actually better simulates the downward vertical flows from the ocean to the underlying layers than Cal-Am's model, and I'll depict why in subsequent slides. Can we go to slide 20?
I'm interrupting you and probably horribly disrupting your chain of thought, but
No,
do you
it's
want to
good.
say anything about the right column here about Cal-Am?
Well, in the sense of time, I don't want to talk too much about it. I think they've covered theirs. They use a blanket of cells of constant head cells in what they represent as layer 1 to represent the ocean, and then conceptually are intending to simulate the downward flow of water through the hydrostratigraphic units beneath the ocean floor into the respective layers, and then eastward, of course, into, because there's seawater or ocean inflow, eastward into the domain. In order to do that, they have to vary, or they have to assign hydraulic conductivities, both horizontal and vertical, that facilitate that movement. So undoubtedly, they have to do the same thing. They have to balance the magnitude of water that's moving from the ocean into the respective layers against what they believe is a reasonable magnitude of ocean inflow. So you can achieve, in my opinion, you could use either method to achieve the same thing. But in order to use the Cal-Am method, you have to go in, and not only do you have to create zones that you're going to, across which you're going to vary the hydraulic conductivities, but you may have to then vary those both in magnitude and spatial extent in order to achieve the same thing that you can achieve by simply moving the linear position of the constant head boundaries using our approach. So the linear approach is simply very much more expedient. It's more direct. And the other thing that is made me decide that was the way I wanted to go, is that we abandoned the desire to use equivalent freshwater heads to simulate the ocean heads. If we were using equivalent freshwater heads, I think it would be really important to do it the other way, the way that Cal-Am did it, because I think it would be the most expedient way to account for increasing head width depth as you move outward into the ocean column. So presumably there would be a larger vertical gradient driving water into the underlying hydrostratigraphic units at a farther distance offshore. But once we decided to use a uniform sea level for the ocean heads in the model domain, that methodology no longer carried any benefit and was just simply too cumbersome for us to be able to effectively use in this effort.
Okay, thank you for taking that additional time to explain that. You may go on.
If we go to slide 19, I'm sorry, slide 20.
Yeah, well, this is slide 20 now.
Now I just want to, these maps reflect the thickness of our respective layers across the model domain. In a hydrostratigraphic model, conceptually, the layer represents, as the name implies, the layer represents your unit. So my intent here is to show how we are respectively simulating the different units that the layers are labeled to represent. So layer 1 in our model represents the water table aquifer, dune sand aquifer, and the colors here represent the variation in thickness. And yes, there are differences in interpretation here, but by my eye, there's not a lot. You can, however, see that we're simulating a thinning water table aquifer as you move to the southeast, which is what I described earlier, which gave rise to the use of evapotranspiration. If we go to the next slide, slide number 21.
Okay, here's slide 21. Go ahead.
Okay, so this one I'll take a little bit more time to describe. This is the SVA. And here is a good time to point out that you cannot directly compare our unit extent boundaries. So one benefit of a hydrostratigraphic modeling approach is that you can just look at the unit extent boundaries and see how the models interpret the extent and thickness of those respective hydrostratigraphic units. And you can do that with ours. So the map on the left depicts our conceptualization of the Salinas Valley aquitard, or if you prefer, the FO SVA/SVA. But whatever the name, our simulation is a uniform, a homogeneous aquitard that inhibits the vertical movement of water from the overlying water table aquifer into the underlying 180-foot aquifer. And therefore, the position of the western extent near the project area, I spent a lot of time working to delineate that and to correlate that to the wave cut terrace, west of which we step down both the elevation of the SVA and the thickness of the SVA so that it pinches out between monitor wells 4 and 7 in the project area, and then follows a roughly linear line that's consistent with other published interpretations of the western extent. So west of that line, or everywhere on our map where the unit is shown to be 1 foot thick, which is the lightest yellow, the SVA does not exist. And therefore, in our model, if the layer exists, it carries the exact properties of a vertically adjacent layer. In order to interpret Cal-Am's model, you can't just look at the distribution of thickness. You have to actually go to Cal-Am 141, figures 15 through 18, and inspect the combination of vertical and horizontal hydraulic connectivities that are assigned in that unit. And if you do that, and if you were to zoom into layer 3, which I believe you spent some time on yesterday, you would see that the assignment of vertical hydraulic connectivity in their model extends significantly farther than what would be indicated is in this map as the western extent of the SVA. Regardless of what is said, the assignment of 0.0001 feet per day for a vertical hydraulic connectivity, which is by chance the same thing that we set our SVA vertical hydraulic connectivity to, is essentially represents something like a clay. And as such, it prevents the downward movement of water. And so in their model, it does exactly the same thing as what is happening in our model. It holds water in the DSA until it flows sufficiently far west to fall off of or west past the assignment of the low vertical hydraulic connectivity, where it can then move vertically downward into the 180-foot aquifer. And if you look closely at those, at that figure 17, layer 3, you'll see that in fact, by my read, they've extended what is in essence the SVA further west than we have. So again, a lot of time spent on something that is in essence not really material to these estimation of impacts. Can we move to the next?
Well, as I understand it, you're basically saying different labels, but basically the same modeling parameters end up resulting from the assignment of the conductivities.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I'll apologize because I admittedly don't put very much weight in names. I put quite a bit of weight in process. And so if it is a very low vertical hydraulic connectivity, it doesn't matter if you call it a sand, it behaves like a clay.
Yeah, I understand that. So, okay.
And in the numerical modeling, if a unit is even only a foot thick and it carries a very low vertical hydraulic connectivity, it still nearly prevents the downward movement of water. So in the real world, a very thin unit would equate to a higher probability of breaks, of breaches or pinch outs, or places where water could move vertically. But in the numerical world, unless you program in those breaks, the assignment of a very low vertical hydraulic connectivity will do exactly what you tell the model that it should do, and it'll prohibit or significantly inhibit the vertical movement of water.
Okay, thanks.
Can we move to slide 22?
Okay, we have slide 22 on the screen now. Go ahead.
this one really doesn't matter, but it bothers me because I argued from the beginning that there was no point including a lower dune sand aquifer in our hydrostratigraphy, but yet Cal-Am insisted that we include a layer in our model. And I spent a fair bit of time working to delineate the lower dune sand aquifer based on the interpretations provided by Cal-Am 2022. I'm sorry, the North Marina groundwater model 2022. And then when we get our results and start talking about it, we find that Cal-Am actually hasn't defined a lower dune sand aquifer. There is a layer present there, but it is uniformly 5 feet thick and doesn't carry any different properties. So effectively, it doesn't exist. Can we move to slide 23, please?
Mr. Lilly, could we get a time check? It's been 60. I know you've interrupted some, so I'm just curious as to how much is left.
Yeah, it's a little hard to keep track here. We started at, I wrote down 9:23. Yeah, it's been an hour. I'm sure my interruptions have, in addition to disrupting Mr. or Dr. Kincaid's train of thought, have taken some time, so that at least 15 minutes. But Dr. Kincaid, how much longer do you think you would like to go? And I'll tell you, because we are sort of coming up to the.
I understand, sir. If you could give me between 5 and 10 more minutes, I believe I can wrap up.
Okay, why don't we do that? And Mr. Osias, the reason I'm going to do that is I've asked him a lot of questions which have taken time and disrupted his train of thought. But let's say 10 minutes max, Dr. Kincaid, and then that'll be the end.
Thank you, sir.
Of yours. Excuse me, the end of your summary. I better be careful. Go ahead.
Well, I will move again more quickly. I just want to flash through these so you can see the differences, which for the most part, I don't think are very different. If you could move to slide number 24. This is the intermediate aquitard, not very different. Could you move to slide 25, please? This is the lower 180-foot aquifer. Again, you can see differences here. In the north, ours is wrapping up against what we interpret to be the outcrop of the 400-foot aquifer. And it has pinched out to the south again against the outcrop of the 400-foot aquifer. But I believe if you go and look at the horizontal and vertical hydraulic connectivities assigned by Cal-Am, you would see that they're attempting to simulate the same basic thing. Can we move to slide 26? This one is in my mind, by my mind, the most significant conceptual difference between our models. And it represents the difference. It represents the 400-foot aquitard. And I'm going to leave it to Ms. Nelson to explain the data that we used in our definition. So I'm going to skip over a couple of slides here. But in essence, you can see there's two things in ours that are represented. Number one, the unit as a whole pinches out to the south as you move into the Monterey subbasin. And that pinch out was explicitly based on our observations of and correlations of groundwater levels, and is consistent with multiple published interpretations of that aquitard in this area. Again, I'll let Ms. Nelson describe that. But if you zoomed in very closely in the vicinity of MCWD 12 or 11 to the northeast of 11, right on the Monterey 180-foot subbasin boundaries, you'll see a hole in the 400-foot aquitard represented in both model interpretations. And this is why I said earlier on that at this point, all three models are representing some degree of hydraulic connection between the upper or the lower 180-foot aquifer, the 180-foot aquifer in this case, and the underlying 400. By my mind, that is a very significant deviation from previous interpretations that Cal-Am has used to depict the hydrostratigraphy. Before, the 400-foot aquifer was buried everywhere and confined everywhere. And now it is unconfined in the southeast, and it is open to the vertical movement of water along the Monterey 180-foot subbasin boundaries. Could we move on to slide 27? Again, not tremendously different. These are thicknesses of the 400-foot aquifer. Could you move on to slide 30, please?
Okay,
So on
slide 30 now, go ahead.
So on slide 30, there's been assertion that we disregarded the interpretations from geoscience as reported on the cross sections. I disagree with that categorically. I've provided you with cross sections that show, not only do they show our interpretation of the position of aquatards, which by my mind are some of the most significant interpretations, and that we spent quite a bit of time on in the hearings and in our experts meetings, but it also shows you how the actual positions of our model layers. So you can see the hydrostratigraphy defined in our model on the cross sections. So I'll call your attention on this one to the 400, 900 foot aquatard, which is the uniformly thick layer there on the bottom. It separates the 400 from the 900. We don't know very much about that unit. I didn't spend a lot of time on it, but it looks kind of funky on this map. And with that, I just want to remind you that there is very significant vertical exaggeration, right? So it doesn't really make these crazy waves. If you were to flatten this out, it would be, it would not, it doesn't look like that. So in essence, if you, in these you have, as you slide through these, if you look at the blue lines and I've labeled them, you can see how we've defined the aquifers, the layers, and our layers that represent aquifers are aquifers, our layers that represent the aquatards are aquatards. So you can see our hydrostratigraphy. The other thing I want to point out, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Mullen, can you just scroll out one notch? I don't have the whole CalAm figure here. Whoops. Maybe, I guess it just doesn't go down as far in the depiction as the MCWD figure does.
It's cut off versus the one that's in the CalAm materials.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, that's fine. We don't need to, but that's as far as it goes. Okay. Anyway, go ahead, Dr. Kincaid, excuse me.
The full extent of these are provided in our revised figures, by the way, that you guys were discussing at the beginning of this session.
Okay.
But I just want to draw your attention to the wells. There's an assertion that these cross sections and the interpretations they represent somehow represent some very certain, highly defensible depiction of the subsurface, and I disagree with that. In fact, these, as are all geologic models, are based on very sparse data. The boreholes are widely spaced. These are not lithologic rock units, but instead unconsolidated sediments that vary significantly both vertically and horizontally, which is in fact the basis for Mr. Durbin's choice to use a texture-based model in this area. So in fact, when you make layers, you are interpreting over a broad area continuity that may or may not exist. So if we just zoom in on the wells, so the wells are put on the cross section presumably to provide some kind of justification or some kind of indication that they're, relying on the data to do that. And we'll see that what are reported with the wells are the distance that the borehole exists away from the section line. And I'm just going to point out the ones that are really far. The first one circled is 2,737 feet. The second one is 1,510 feet. And the third one is 1,878 feet. So these, in fact, you have very sparse data, and these are just that. They're an interpretation of the lithology between these boreholes. Can we move to the next slide?
So before we do that, why you have this funky hump in the 400, the aquitard between the 400 and the deep, but there's on the far right, there's no well there. So what's the basis for somebody putting that hump in there if they don't really have any lithological data?
I base that on the thickness of the 400-foot aquifer. So I used various sources of data to define the thickness of the 400-foot aquifer. So the primary surfaces, the primary effort that is represented here is really focused on 2 unit surfaces and then all of the unit thicknesses. The key unit surfaces are the 400-foot aquifer and the SVA. So I already explained that I used, I put a fair bit of time into correlating the surface of the SVA to the wave cut terrace. And then correlate whenever you build a surface, you correlate that to ideally to pics from borehole logs. We didn't have the time to do that, so I tried to correlate that generally to, well, I drew in GIS interpretations on the cross sections and then brought those into GIS as a data set representing elevations for the respective unit tops. Added to that data that I got from other interpretations of cross sections, outcrop information of like where the 400 outcrops, and then frankly, some assumptions about continuity of thickness, or continuity of how the elevations seem like they were trending. Once I did that, I got a top of the 400-foot aquifer. And then I went back using the same and other data sets to define a spatial distribution of probable thickness of the 400-foot aquifer. And then I created two different grids, one for the top and one for the thickness. And then the top of the 900-foot aquitard becomes the top of the 400-foot aquifer minus the thickness of the 400-foot aquifer. And that gives you the top of the 900-foot aquitard. So in essence, there's very little data or interpretations available to define the 900-foot aquitard or the 900-foot aquifer. So it is hung on the top of the aquitard is hung on the effort made to model the distribution of thickness of the 400-foot aquifer. And then the 900-foot aquitard looks uniform in thickness because it is. I assumed it to be 50 feet thick everywhere.
Okay.
So that's why it looks the way it does. The SVA was done similarly, and then the other units are stacked on the basis of thickness to achieve their surfaces.
Okay. So why don't you just, I've interrupted again, but can you just wrap it up here in a couple of minutes, please?
Yeah. Please go to slide number 34. And if we go to slide number 34, the same thing. This is on section 4B, or what I called 4B, section 4. And in particular, if you look on the south, what I want to draw attention to is the interpretation of the continuity of the 400-foot aquitard that's built into the CalAm model. It's really hard to discern, but you can see the green layer that extends to the west and then truncates into the purple layer that comes up and then goes flat to the south. That is a very consequential interpretation because it effectively seals or prevents hydraulic communication between the lower 180-foot aquifer and the underlying 400-foot aquifer. Remember that it doesn't have to be very thick to be very effective in the numerical world. So here they're interpreting that the 400-foot aquitard is continuous across the domain on the basis of very sparse data. And even if you look at the borehole through which it is drawn on the west, and you zoom in, that borehole is quite far away from the well. I believe it's 2,230 feet. So it's a big stretch. Can we go to slide number 36 or 37, please? Slide number 37. And here I just want to show you what I want to point out is in contrast is the methodology for interpreting the hydrostratigraphy. We endeavored to use as much as possible. We wanted our units to be homogeneous, so that as we added heterogeneity, it would be added in such a way that it could conform to gross geologic processes as we interpret them from the available data. And what we don't want to do is go in and create individual zones in order to achieve a better calibration result at an individual well. And in my mind, doing that is what is quite literally the definition of what in the modeling world we describe as over-parameterization. So in essence, now you can compare, on the left, we have our hydrostratigraphic interpretation of the water table aquifer. You can see that there are essentially two zones. One hydraulic conductivity area that's roughly on the north side of the river, one that's on the south side, and then the south side becomes progressively higher hydraulic conductivity as you move to the beach. which is all consistent with the geologic map. In fact, the highest conductivity zone is, I believe it's the QD zone, the dune sand aquifer zone that is defined on the geologic map. By contrast, we have the kaleidoscope of zones in the CalAm model that are defined to facilitate calibration and pest. And that raises some problems that we can discuss, hopefully discuss later, but you can see the difference in conductivities. And if we just scroll through these, I'm not going to go through them all, but you'll see one thing that you'll see if you subsequently look closely is that where our units don't exist, the hydraulic conductivities for the adjacent material are exactly the same as the overlying or underlying material. And that is not the same in CalAm, which means that effectively every unit is both vertically and horizontally heterogeneous, which makes it a lot more akin to the texture model that Mr. Durbin created rather than a hydrostratigraphic model.
Okay, so I think we're going to have to wrap it up now, Dr.
Okay.
You've covered a lot. I've interrupted a lot, but I think we really have taken as much time. In fairness to the CalAm witnesses, who I did cut off Dr. Ye as well. So I'm going to just cut you off there, and we're going to take a 15-minute break, and then we'll start with. Let's see if we'll start with Ms. Nelson. Let's make it, it's just past 10:40. So 10:55, let's go ahead and be ready to go with Ms. Nelson and her summary. And again, I apologize for interrupting Dr. Kincaid, but I do have to try to treat everybody equally here.
I understand.
Let's do that. 10:55 as a reminder, if you don't want us to hear your conversations during the break, go on mute and we'll all come back at 10:55. Thank you.
Mr. Lilly, just a heads up, your camera's still on.
Thank you. Okay, people are coming back. Mr. Waldridge, could you just, you sent me a text. Could you just explain what you did with the revised versions of exhibits MCWD 160 and 161?
Yeah, I just saved new versions of both of those PowerPoint presentations with slide numbers included.
Okay, and did you keep the old versions or just delete the old versions?
I kept them.
Okay, so they're just listed as revised.
Yeah, I listed with slide numbers, I think.
Okay, so the only difference is it added the slide numbers.
That's correct.
Yeah, okay, thank you. All right.
Oh.
And I apologize. I think I interrupted Dr. Kincaid way too many times, but I just thought as questions came up, I would ask them. So, Mr. Burchard, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Lilly. There were a couple, 2 or 3 points that I don't think Dr. Kincaid got to finish on, and we would like to give him 5 more minutes to do that, and we will take that away from Ms. Nelson's time, if that's okay.
Okay, why don't we do that? And go ahead, Dr. Kincaid, and just ask us which ones.
He's going to start on exhibit 161, slide 44.
Okay, MCWD 161, slide 44.
Thank you, Mr. Lilly. Yeah, there we go. I can see that you're coming up now.
We'll get to slide 44.
On slide 44, thank you, sir. And I also just want to thank Ms. Nelson for sacrificing a little bit of her time. Hopefully she doesn't realize how consequential that is here very shortly. But I want to finish this topic of over-parameterization. What does that mean? Well, I think at this point, most people here are familiar enough with modeling to know that one of the things we do is change parameter settings in order to try to match heads. But in reality, that's just one component of what is a good calibration effort. You're trying to match observations of all of the observable processes that are reasonably simulated in your model. So if, however, you just focus laser-like on the match to heads, you can miss some other correlations or some processes that are important to your model domain. So this is an example. We were more poorly calibrated in the upper 180-foot aquifer in the southwest corner of the model domain than in the project area or through the central portion of the model domain. Since this area was near the MCWD's wells, it was of particular attention or particular concern. We looked at it more carefully and essentially realized that this correlates, as you might remember, to the map that I presented at the very beginning of my presentation, to the high groundwater elevations that are along the coast. And as it turns out, there is a significant groundwater injections that are taking place into the upper 180-foot aquifer. And since those groundwater injections are not incorporated into our model, it's actually appropriate that we are underestimating heads in this area because the model isn't adequately representing the process or one of the processes that is responsible for those heads, which are the injections. So in this case, calibrating to heads results in an inappropriate estimation of hydraulic conductivity, which then carries through to an inappropriate assignment of or prediction of impact. So I'm sure lots of us have heard this principle applied to various aspects of our lives, but it holds true in modeling as well, that as much as possible, you try to keep it simple, stupid. It's the KISS principle. So that's an example of over-parameterization. If we go to slide number 44, please.
This is 44.
I'm sorry, go, once again, I'm caught. Go to slide 45, please.
Okay.
45, please. On 45, I know Ms. Nelson will talk a little bit about this in her testimony, but another consequence of over-parameterization can be incongruities, let's just say strange phenomena in the groundwater flow field. And sometimes that can't be seen straight away with the heads, but when you start running particle tracks, you can start to see, strange things that are occurring. This is an example of circular flow that's occurring right along the ocean shoreline interface. I suspect that if we investigated this, it would be correlated to one or more of those very small parameterization zones that take place or that have been assigned both vertically and horizontally in the hydraulic conductivity field. Again, in my opinion, features like this have been consistent with and over parameterized, or let's just say a problem with the parameterization. And then, so at that point, I'll just, if we could go to slide number 48. And really here, it's been pointed out that, the model that we submitted in June 12th is actually a little bit less calibrated. Yes, that is true. But in my opinion, it's actually better calibrated than the May 31 model because it's not consequentially different in its normalized root mean square error. The worst in the aquifers that I was really paying attention to, I wasn't paying very much attention to, and quite frankly, I'm not concerned by the poor calibration in the 900-foot aquifer. I am more concerned, obviously, with the upper 180, but as I just pointed out, without correcting for the absence of the injection wells, it would be my expectation that we would calibrate more poorly in that layer. And until we have the ability to fix that, it's hard to see what's going on. But the June 12 substantially better simulates the seawater intrusion across the domain. It was said in the previous testimony that our June 12 model, the model that we currently have, somehow simulates like 50 or 60,000 acre feet per year. I don't know what they did wrong, but they quite frankly, they just did that query wrong. Our calibrated model version, when queried correctly, simulates less than 20,000 acre feet per year of seawater intrusion in layers 1 through 8. Which represent the layers through which we're really concerned. We also simulate something like 20,000, actually 19,700 acre feet per year of intrusion in the 900-foot aquifer. No, I'm sorry, 10,218 acre feet per year in the 900-foot aquifer. Whether that's appropriate or not is, I think, open to debate. But the one I was concerned about is the seawater intrusion in the upper layers. And again, we're simulating less than 19,000, 18,686 acre feet per year. And now I'm just going to wrap up. And I want to draw your attention to the slides that I submitted. We don't have to open them. I know we don't have time for that. But what you'll see if and when you do open those, is that the drawdown in the version in which we changed the pumping to 4456 from the 1981 does simulate less drawdown. It still continues to simulate between 0.5 and 1 feet of drawdown across the areas that MCWD we're most concerned with, but it does simulate less drawdown. From my perspective, that doesn't reflect an error, as I've said. I think and for our model, the assignments that we used are actually more correct. But if I'm very fair as I can be, it really reflects an effect of uncertainty. We don't actually know what the distribution of flow quantities are going to be. So what we can really see is that if the extraction occurs in the higher aquifers, the impact will be less. The sensitivity of the predicted impacts to the elevation of the open interval from which the slant well water will be drawn is therefore relatively high. So these maps indicate that the predicted impacts will be less when the water is extracted from a higher elevation. So the closer the proposed pumping wells get to a horizontal position, the smaller the impacts are likely to be. The last thing I'll point out is there's been lots of assertion that this model is somehow almost exactly the same as all the previous models that have been brought up. And I take exception with that. I started working on these models back in first, I believe, in 2014. I went back and looked at our evaluation of drawdown from the 2016, 2017 models. And I computed the difference in the extent of 0.5 feet of drawdown as depicted in these models versus the previous ones. And I'm getting a difference of These models are predicting an extent of 0.5 feet of drawdown that's almost 11,000 feet farther in the 400-foot aquifer now than it was then. And in the 180-foot aquifer, I'm getting a distance of roughly 8,300 feet further in the southern direction and 6,500 feet further along the southwest direction nearer to the coast. So there are substantial differences, particularly when you consider the definition of impacts that I presented.
Okay.
And with that, I draw it. I'm done. Thank you very much.
Can you just very, very shortly and succinctly tell me who is doing injection in this area you are talking about?
With respect, sir, I know that Ms. Nelson will talk in detail about that.
Fair enough. We'll ask her. So you did push your 5 minutes into 10. I'm going to allow Ms. Nelson 40 minutes, and I'm going to try not to interrupt. That clearly is not a good thing for our time efficiency. But 40 minutes for Ms. Nelson to summarize, and then we'll see where we are. So let's go ahead, Ms. Nelson, if you can appear. And I'm going to just ask the same background questions. Is Exhibit MC, first of all, good morning. And a reminder, you still are under oath from the oath you took in the prior round of this hearing. And then I'm going to ask you, is Exhibit MCWD 126 your supplemental direct testimony for this proceeding?
Yes.
And then is Exhibit MCWD 150 your rebuttal testimony to Mr. Durbin's testimony for this proceeding?
Yes.
And is Exhibit 150 MCWD 153 the remainder of your rebuttal testimony for this phase of the proceeding?
Yes.
And then is Exhibit MCWD 160 your slides for this proceeding?
Yes.
Okay, and that, as with the other witnesses, that does authenticate. I realize you have several reports and technical memoranda that are cross-referenced. So from my view, this authentication covers all of those as well. So with that, Ms. Mullen, if you can please display Exhibit MCWD 160. I've got 1108, and we'll just go till 1148 unless I ask questions that extend that time, but please go ahead with your summary.
Yes, I'm going to skip any introductions. I think you're familiar with me. Next slide.
And we certainly are, so that's fine. I remember from your testimony from the prior proceeding, so go ahead. We're on slide.
The state board asked that the experts look at some of the differences between the MCWD and CalAM models and identify the basis for their conceptualizations of the hydrostratigraphy. Some of the significant differences between CalAM and MCWD's models include the extent and thickness of hydrogeologic units, the range and distribution of hydraulic conductivities, and the estimated recharge rates and calibration period. And I'm going to really hone in on the things that I think are very important here. I think you've heard an awful lot about all the differences, but I really want to focus on how MCWD came to its conceptualization. Next slide. The work that we have done is almost wholly consistent with the Fort Ord remedial investigation reports that have been developed over the last 30 years. They have been approved by the U.S. Army, the U.S. EPA, and the Central Coast Regional Board. Our interpretation of the western extent of the FOSVA is also consistent with State Board Gamma Team's evaluation near the project site, regional geologic maps, and the Monterey Subbasin GSP, which was adopted by MCWD GSA, Salinas Valley Basin GSA, and approved by DWR. MCWD's interpretations, consider not only geologic data, but really use groundwater data and chemical data to, help with the conceptualizations that have been incorporated into these models. Next slide. This is a figure that shows the groundwater levels, basically the potentiometric surface map in the dune sand aquifer. It also shows the area of fresh water based on well data, which is the lighter blue, and the area where you see all of those black dots. Those are all wells that are part of Fort Ord. There's hundreds of wells that have been installed as part of Fort Ord. And one of the reasons that they've been required to clean up this aquifer, as well as the upper 180-foot aquifer, is that it is fresh. The TDS in those wells is all less than 1,000 milligrams per liter of TDS, and therefore subject to the requirements of the Regional Water Quality Control Board and US EPA. The southern extent of the FOSVA is shown as a black dashed line on the left. That's it as it has been identified by Fort Ord. It has been extended to the north between MW4S and 7S, consistent with the state board's interpretation of the extent of that aquitard. And this aquitard is very important, as Dr. Kincaid has indicated. And the key, and the reason it's so important, is that fresh water from the dune sand aquifer basically flows to the western extent of this aquitard and then makes a U-turn. It actually comes back into the basin. And that's because the heads in the upper 180-foot aquifer have become depressed through all the pumping that has occurred within the Salinas Valley. And so that water then recharges and enters the basin back in. Next slide.
And for the record, we are now on slide 5. Go ahead.
This actually is a conceptual site model that is directly from Fort Ord's website. It shows how the dune sand aquifer, basically you have groundwater that, I should say, precipitation that enters the groundwater system. It flows on the top of the dune sand, the Fort Ord Salinas Valley aquitard within the dune sand aquifer. It is called the A aquifer in many cases within the Fort Ord information, but it is composed of dune sands. And then that water basically flows down, makes a U-turn, and ends up in the upper 180-foot aquifer, and then migrates even further downward through gaps in the intermediate aquitard to recharge the lower 180-foot aquifer and 400-foot aquifer. One of the other things that you'll notice on this figure is that there is no aquitard that is depicted between the lower 180-foot aquifer and 400-foot aquifer in the Fort Ord area. And that is because they have seen basically the same water levels in those two aquifers, and they plot the potentiometric surface as one figure between the lower 180-foot aquifer and the 400-foot aquifer. And I'll show some of the data that's the basis for that conceptual understanding that's been developed at Fort Ord. Next slide.
We're on slide 6. Go ahead.
So this is a figure that shows the potentiometric surface map of the upper 180-foot aquifer. And as you can see, groundwater in this aquifer, which is right below the Salinas Valley aquitard, is inland. And again, this is because of all of the extraction that is occurring in the inland areas of the Salinas Valley groundwater basin. And again, this aquifer, because it is recharged from the upper dune sand, is also fresh. You see all of those wells, there are those little black dots. All of those wells have TDS concentrations less than 1,000 milligrams per liter. Again, why Fort Ord has spent $300 million cleaning this site up. You'll see a smattering of wells right next to the coast, right there in the at the what I want to say the southern coastal side of the Monterey subbasin. That's the area that Dr. Kincaid was talking about. It turns out Fort Ord had a release right next to the coast. Water was fresh. The regional board said, we will clean it up. So what they did is they started doing extractions. They were required, because the water was fresh, to inject, to stop seawater intrusion from occurring near the coastline into their extraction wells and creating harm to the basin. Those wells are much less than 2 miles from the beach. And the data that's being, so that's part of, there's a lot of water that's being injected there right now, which does cause a mound. But as Fort Ord has over the last 30 years been quite successful in cleaning up the material that was released, we anticipate that that injection will eventually stop. And then we will be left with the original groundwater conditions before Fort Ord, when Fort Ord was mandated to clean up those that contamination. Which means the water levels will drop back to their initial levels, which were fresh, but not at the same mounding that they currently are.
So
Next
I'm
slide.
curious, Ms. Nelson, where do they get the water to inject there?
So they do a lot of pump and treat across both the dune sand and the upper 180-foot aquifer in the inland areas. So you see a lot of those, all of those wells basically that you see in that 180-foot aquifer, they were installed in order to monitor the migration of groundwater plumes. And
Okay.
one of the typical ways that groundwater is treated is that it is withdrawn down gradient of the release, and then it is treated and re-injected back into the aquifer. There are places where they allow you to put it back into a storm drain. That's not the case here because of the overdraft in this basin. They've been mandated to re-inject it and make sure that it re-enters the aquifer.
Okay, thanks. And sorry for the interruption. We'll go on to slide 7.
These are some of the historic plumes that existed in the at Fort Ord, and they have shrunk quite a bit. But they were, you can see the direction of groundwater flow, basically chemical flow, and it's on this basis that the extent of the FOSBA is been identified as quite a bit further to the west than the wave cut terrace, which is where CalAm has postulated that it ends. And you can see that not only groundwater levels extend beyond the wave cut terrace and drive the flow towards the west, but as the chemical plumes did as well. And those are really tracers for groundwater flow. Next slide.
All right, we're on slide 8. Go ahead.
And this relates to the state board's valuation of the extent of the FOSBA near the project. They looked at the groundwater levels in the upper well, which is the dune sand well, which are known as MW7S, and then underneath MW4S. These are hydrographs over time that were collected by CalAm. And you can see that the groundwater levels in 7S, which is at the top there, the two hydrographs below it actually indicate MW7M and 7D, which are screened deeper. They're screened in the 180-foot aquifer and the 400-foot aquifer, from which agricultural pumping in the Salinas Valley occurs. So it has a very seasonal fluctuation. You basically see it go down when the pumps come on, and you see it go back up when the pumps go off. 7S, as you notice, does not. And on that, based on that, the state board concluded that MW7S sits on top of the aquitard, and it is basically isolated from the fluctuations that are occurring in the lower aquifers. MW4S, which is closer to the coast, as you can see, in that case, 4S actually mimics the fluctuations that you see in 4M and 4D. And that, based on their interpretation, indicates that the aquitard is much less effective in that area. So this is a demonstration where someone has utilized groundwater data to inform their interpretation of the hydrostratigraphy, rather than just relying on geologic information. Next slide.
We're on slide 9. Go ahead.
So these are figures. The figure on the left is based on AEM data. And the reason that I've included it is because it provides a really nice picture of what's happening in the subsurface and the conceptual model that was developed by Fort Ord. So you can see that upper layer on the left, you'll see something that says the dune sand aquifer. The AEM data identifies the area which is fresh as blue. And you can see how it basically goes towards the beach and then dives down and comes back around into the upper 180-foot aquifer where the gradients are inland. And what this actually does is it creates a protective head near the coast. So if you look at the figure on the right, what's essentially happening is the dune sand aquifer is actually acting as an injection barrier for the upper 180-foot aquifer. As the water flows off the FOSVA, it basically provides a source of recharge and creates a mound, as Dr. Kincaid identified it, right along the shore. And that seawater protective head, it's not very much. It's only a few feet in a couple places. But it is what keeps the upper 180-foot aquifer fresh, because the groundwater levels in that aquifer, as you move away from the beach, are in fact below sea level. And so if we lose that few feet of protective head, it's very significant. And that's why we have been so adamant that the project, even a few feet, half a foot, that takes away some of that protective head that is keeping the upper 180-foot aquifer fresh. Next slide. This is what
10.
basically, go ahead.
I just said we're on slide 10. Go ahead.
So this is what happens when you lose that seawater protective head. Now ocean water can flow unimpeded into the upper 180-foot aquifer. And so this is why Dr. Kincaid identified this as harm. The drawdown that is happening, that would happen along the coast as a result of the project, has potential very significant impacts on seawater, on the seawater intrusion front within the upper 180-foot aquifer. Next slide.
This is slide 11. Go ahead.
This relates to work that's again been done by Fort Ord. And this is these wells are areas where Fort Ord has identified the absence of the basically the aquitard between the 180 and 400-foot aquifers. And they have identified this as an area where there is no aquitard, because the groundwater levels in the wells in these locations, there's nested wells. They have 4 or 5 screens in a lot of cases, because they're really trying to track the groundwater levels as well as chemical migration in these areas. And what you see, and I'm not going to blow this up, you can look in my testimony, but basically the water levels are almost identical in the wells that are screened in the upper 180, basically the lower 180-foot aquifer and the 400-foot aquifer. So what that tells us, and what it told Fort Ord, is that there's not an effective aquitard. So even though you might see an aquitard in some borings in some locations, it's not effective. Next slide.
Slide 12. Go ahead.
This is the surficial geology map, which Dr. Kincaid talked about. This is the area of the aroma sand where the 400-foot aquifer comes to the surface. And that's the area there that's identified. These are areas identified in red, and those are incorporated in NCWD's model. CalAM's model now also incorporates this conceptualization of the 400. It's not quite as extensive as these units would suggest, but they do now have, basically surfacing of that 400-foot layer, which we think is so important. Next slide.
This is slide 13. Go ahead.
The calibration period and recharge have been just a source of tremendous back and forth, as if you've read all of the tech memos and everything between the experts. I can tell you from my perspective, what I believe, the experts decided and then how things went. But when we looked at this, the experts tried to identify a calibration period during which there were pretty average water levels. And that was a period where the wells the project wells, which were basically MW1 through 9, effectively, there was data for. And those wells weren't installed until after 2015. And then the test slant well is, I'm realizing I'm about to lose power.
Uh-oh.
I've got to plug in. I'm sorry.
It's all right.
If you do the laptop, I'll find it. Okay. I should be fine. Apologize.
That's fine. We all have
Technical
these things
difficulties.
happen. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so basically the calibration period that we selected as a group initially was 2019 through 2021, because we had data from all of the project wells, and it was after the test slant well had stopped pumping. So we wouldn't have to back out, how much the test slant well was impacting the wells and have a lot of arguments. And so these are the average precipitation that was identified based on the PRISM data set, which is from Oregon State, I believe it is, University, collects and interpolates data from different weather stations for certain areas. And it showed that it was basically average precipitation during that period. There was the long-term model-based period that was also selected from 2009 to 2021. Again, very, very consistent with the long-term, historical period. And later we found out Cal-Am was having an issue with that. We believe there are reasons why they were starting to have an issue with that. And they basically argued for utilizing a different precipitation period during the calibration. So what they basically said is, no, the precipitation that actually occurred in 2019 through 2021 shouldn't be utilized for the calibration. You should assume that actually the precipitation that occurred between 2017 to 2019 is what occurred during the calibration period, because there's this lag. And the water, basically the rainfall during that period was 18.64 inches, which is quite a bit more than what actually occurred in the calibration period. And so, and the idea was, well, there's, there's a very large unsaturated zone. And so as a result, it takes a long time for the water to actually hit the aquifer, the dune sand aquifer. And there are areas of the dune sand aquifer where there's 100 feet of thickness. And maybe it would be appropriate to utilize a lag if you really looked at statistically. The problem is that they wanted to apply it uniformly everywhere. And to be quite honest, the key wells, so many of the key wells that we're looking at have less than 40 feet of A beta zone. And so in our opinion, just unilaterally applying that type of a lag without really any really firm statistical demonstrated analysis is just wrong. I don't know how else to say that, but at the end of the day, I don't know how much it matters. But I felt the need, because there's been so much back and forth on this. This is our opinion. What it ends up happening as a result of this is that you tend to underestimate the water levels that will occur during the future scenarios. So you will predict that water levels will actually be lower than what you would have gotten had you used the precipitation during the calibration period. And that's a little bit of concern, particularly given that Mr. Durbin's model underpredicts heads at the boundaries. As he discussed, he's between 7 feet and 3 feet too low at the boundaries based on available data. And so as such, this exacerbates that problem because you're going to be even lower than what he is. That's our opinion, Dr. Kincaid's and mine, about the use of the lag. Next slide.
All right, this is slide 14. Go ahead.
So the other thing that's been a huge debate, of course, is the recharge. And one of the things that I took an awful lot of time to look at was the recharge in the dune sand surficial complex. So that's the area identified in red. This is an area which is pretty unique within the Salinas Valley. And in my opinion, it is not equivalent to the areas in other portions of the Salinas Valley, where so much of the recharge estimates, for native plants, et cetera, have been done. CalAm compiled a huge number of historical data that says, oh, the recharge in the Salinas Valley is, 1.5 inches per year or whatever. And my comment was, well, that's not in the sand that I've got right here. So we spent an awful lot of time really trying to model this and do our best job at trying to evaluate what the potential recharge in this dune sand complex is, because we think it is very unique. And we ran a USGS 2018 soil moisture balance model, which simulates daily precipitation, simulates runoff based on soil properties and flow between cells. It also considers stormwater capture and recharge that is done by MCWD. They have spent many millions of dollars implementing a system that does not allow the stormwater that is discharged into their storm drains to run to the ocean. They re-infiltrate it. People are very interested in keeping as much water in this basin as possible. There's been a lot of work associated with Mr. Durbin did do a soil moisture balance model, but in looking at what he did, it utilizes monthly precipitation. It doesn't actually simulate runoff. It utilizes a generic factor, which doesn't consider hydraulic properties of soil. And so, in my opinion, the work that we did was a far greater and more detailed analysis of this. The other thing, Mr. Durbin also submitted recently a TM, which talked about utilizing chloride concentrations to estimate recharge in native areas, basically native areas where there's no irrigation, basically where precipitation is the only source of recharge, and you can do a mass balance, which indicates, if you understand what the chloride concentration is of the precipitation, you can try and back out what the recharge rate is. Mr. Durbin unfortunately did not realize that 70% of the wells that he identified and looked at the data for are within MCWD's service area, which basically means they irrigate with water that is provided by MCWD, which is groundwater. It's not rainwater. So the analysis is essentially flawed. Next slide.
Okay,
I think this,
slide 15, go ahead.
I think this figure really demonstrates how different the dune sand aquifer complex is. If you can see, there's no streams running through that area. What that means is there's no runoff. Look at everywhere else in the Salinas Valley. You see all those streams? Those are caused by runoff. The dune sand is very unique. It is so permeable that basically there's no streams that are formed. That's why if you look at all the other models that have been developed for the Salinas Valley and give you generic recharge rates, they're not applicable, which is why we spent the time and we produced and did all of this work to try and estimate the recharge. Next slide.
Slide 16, go ahead.
In the end, the model estimates, and it was based initially on our estimates, and then there was work that was done to do some further calibration. MCWD's model, when taking into account evapotranspiration that was added in areas where the groundwater table is incredibly close to the ground surface, estimates at 6.14 inches per year.
So which period is that for? There are two listed here, 2019 to 2021 and 2009 to 2021, but only
They're
one.
the same, because when we ran the model actually for the 2019 to 2021 period, and we ran it again for the 2009 to 2021, and the recharge estimates were essentially identical.
Okay, thank you.
Ironically, CalAm ended up using very, very similar values. We do not know how they got there. They created a lot of criticism of what we did. Maybe in the end, they saw the light. I don't know. But in their 2017, 2019 calibration period, they used 6.63 inches per year. Now, this is, again, for a period which is they had a higher precipitation. But in their long-term period, they were at 5.62 inches per year. They're within half an inch of us. I mean, you know, if we're down to that type of a argument, I mean, I think we've got better things to do. So I think it's one of the reasons that you see the results of the models actually being quite similar. Next slide.
Okay, this will be slide 17.
I'm going to skip this.
Go on to slide 18.
I'm just going to make a quick comment here that the regional extraction barrier as simulated by CalAm is just, it's with no and presumes no replacement of extracted water, would be totally non-Sigma compliant. I mean, basically they're extracting 30,000 acre feet per year from a basin which is in overdraft and not replacing the water. I can tell you that the basin, irrelevant of seawater intrusion, is already estimated to be short by 15,000 acre feet per year. You add another 30,000 to that, you're going to drop the water levels like crazy. I mean, it's ludicrous. Next slide.
Slide 19 is now up.
Yeah, this is the Sigma scenario by that was developed by MCWD. Basically, it's the reduction of groundwater extraction of about 25,000 acre feet from the 180-foot aquifer subbasin. It's a significant reduction. It's a 23% reduction in the overall rate of extraction within that basin. I'm not telling you that that's not a problem, but in the Salinas Valley groundwater basin, it's only a reduction of 5.3%. And in the end, if you did this, you would not have a problem. Not only would you not have a problem with seawater intrusion, you would bring the water levels back up. And so if you did that, you wouldn't have, not only would you not have a seawater intrusion problem, but you wouldn't have to desalinate the water. I mean, so I'll let you come to your own conclusions with that. Next slide.
This is slide 20.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you've heard from many of the experts is that the results actually of the two local models are quite similar. The difference is in the interpretation of the results. MCWD's basically indicates, and our opinion is that the predicted capture zones are significant, and they'll draw water from the ocean as well as inland sources. They'll increase seawater inflows into the coastal subbasins, which will exacerbate accumulation of seawater within these subbasins. And this is both within and outside of the capture zones. I mean, don't forget that if water is brought into the capture zone, if for some reason the project dies, that's all water that's going to enter the, these subbasins, in addition to the water that escapes the capture zone that's being brought in. It'll also increase cross-boundary flows from the Monterey subbasin into the 180-foot aquifer subbasin, which is something that I'd like to specifically talk about. And of course, as I discussed, just the water level drawdowns around, along the coast is a particular concern given this situation with the mounding at the coastline. I'm going to skip quite a few slides here because I know I'm running out of time.
You have about 10 minutes left, so select the slides you think are most important. And I can assure you, I have read your technical report, and I'm sure my staff has and will read that as well. So you don't need to cover it all today. We know it's there and we will read it.
So I'd like to go to slide 25, please.
Okay, this is slide 25.
And Dr. Kincaid talked about this slide, and this is really the estimation of the additional seawater inflows that will occur both inside and outside of the capture zones. Reach 2, of course, is the one we are most concerned about because that's the Monterey subbasin. Next slide. This is an analysis going back to your request where we have taken a look at basically 3A minus 1A and 3B minus 1B, et cetera. And so this is the increase in ocean inflows. And I want you to take a look at Reach 2. This is MCWD's model. And what we're basically seeing under the non-sigma scenarios, which is basically A and B, that there's approximately additional 1,000 acre feet that's coming in. Now, in MCWD's model, there's about 1,500 acre feet of seawater coming in the upper 8 layers, which are basically the outside of the deep aquifer. And those are the basically the lower 180 and the 400 are the ones that are seawater intruded. So this represents a 60% increase in ocean inflows along that reach, which we consider very significant. Next slide. This is CalAM's model. And again, they're actually estimating slightly less than we are, but as a percentage, they're actually very close because their estimated inflows along the reach 2 in the non-sigma scenarios are about 1,000 acre feet. And so they're increasing it by 60 to 70%.
And for the record, that was slide 27. Go ahead.
Slide 29.
Okay, we're on slide 29.
One of the questions that you asked, Mr. Lilly, is so where does the water go that enters the subbasin?
Outside the capture zone, yes.
Outside of the capture zone. And Dr. Ye basically claims in his testimony that it enters the capture zone. We strongly disagree with that. That's inconsistent with the definition of a capture zone. It's also not supported by the path lines. What we did is we seeded CalAM's model with particles along the path line, both within the capture zone. So that's the predicted capture zone, the area in blue, the light blue. And then we seeded particles outside of that. And what you can see, and this is in layer 4, which is the lower dune sand, effectively the upper 180, where if you seed particles, they go both to the northeast, and then they also drop down. So what these particles show you is that the basically the water as it enters migrates towards basically the pumping centers in the 180 foot aquifer. You remember all those wells that were showed when we discussed the regional model. And what basically ends up happening is the water comes in and it moves to the northeast because of the amount of pumping that's happening over there. It does not get captured. There's also, you can see path lines that are within the capture zone that don't get captured. And that's interesting because it means that the size of the capture zone, it's not the same in all the layers. You really have to take a really good look at which layer is which. And some of the deeper layers, what ends up happening is water might get drawn in, but not captured. So our opinion is that the inflows that are occurring outside of the capture zone are not captured and they don't disappear. That would be inconsistent with conservation of mass. Next slide.
All right.
These are basically
Slide
some of the
30.
other particle tracks that are in the other layers, which is the upper 180-foot aquifer. Next slide. This is the lower 180-foot aquifer. Next slide. And this is what Dr. Kincaid pointed out. When we took a look at the particles along the coast in the dune sand aquifer, they seem to be circulating, which I wouldn't expect from a hydrogeologic concept. I'm not a modeler, but if I look at this, it sure seems like there's something very strange going on.
Okay, for the record, this is slide 32. Go ahead.
I'm going to go to slide 35, please.
Okay, slide 35 is now up.
One of the things that the court asked is that we estimate the reduction in groundwater storage. And we did that for both MCWD's and CalAM's model. You can see that CalAM actually has a lot of drawdown in the north of the river. I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's a numerical problem or if they believe that, but note, next slide. If you use a pretty typical specific yield of about 0.12, which is what was used in the Monterey subbasin, you find that the estimated loss in the dune storage in the dune sand aquifer based on MCWD's model is in the range of 1,500 to 2,000 acre feet, depending on which scenario. And the estimated loss in storage that CalAM would estimate is in the range of 3,500 to as much as basically 6,000 acre feet.
And again, this is really scenario 2A minus 1A and 3A minus 1.
Yes,
Okay,
yes. And the last thing I'd like to talk about is on slide 38.
Okay.
And this is very critical from our standpoint. And, you know, in looking at Mr. Durbin and Mr. Leffler's continuous comments that basically there's going to be a change in the seawater intrusion front and it's going to be drawn back to the slant wells. Well, if that's true, then it will also induce fresh water to flow back towards the slant wells that exists from the Monterey subbasin. You sort of can't have it both ways. And what we did is we took a look at what are the incremental cross-boundary flows that are going to occur from the Monterey subbasin into the 180-foot aquifer subbasin as a result of the project. And what we found is within the capture zone itself, there's clearly water that enters the Monterey subbasin from the ocean within the capture zone and then goes into the 180-foot aquifer subbasin. So, you know, that just contaminates the water within the Monterey subbasin, but it doesn't actually, I guess, take our water. The rest of it basically flows across the boundary. And what we found is that there's an increase in outflows of about 660 to 670 acre feet per year outside of what CalAM is called sort of the mixing zone. Now, I would suggest that there's probably some water from the dune sand aquifer that enters that mixing zone. So it's not all a freebie, but if we really just look at the area that is outside of that mixing zone, we have about 660 to 870 acre feet per year. Now, some of this is probably seawater, the additional seawater that they've drawn into our aquifer, basically, that's going to pass through the Monterey subbasin and go back into the 180-foot aquifer. But I would suggest that anything that is in the dune sand aquifer in the 180-foot, upper 180-foot aquifer, well, that's fresh, consistent with the fact that Fort Ord is having to clean that up. And that is water that's very, very important to MCWD. Currently, there's an overdraft in the Monterey subbasin of 4,424 acre feet estimated. I'm going to tell you, it's in the range of 4,000 acre feet per year. And that's because of all the pumping that's going on in the 180-foot aquifer subbasin. Even though there's sufficient recharge, there's over 10,000 acre feet per year of recharge in the Monterey subbasin. And overall pumping in the Monterey subbasin is about 5,600 acre feet. MCWD pumps about 3,500 acre feet. Even a 500 acre per year, every year of water leaving the subbasin will dramatically impact the sustainable yield of our subbasin.
When you say average loss in storage, oh, I'm sorry, it says AFY, so that is per year. So
per year.
Do those numbers roughly add up? 5641 plus 4424. I'm going to try to do that quickly in my head. That's pretty darn close.
So
it's exactly the same. Okay, that equals 10,055. Thank you.
No, but what you're missing is, okay, so we get 10,000 and then we pump 5,800. So we should be fine, right? Wouldn't that be great? But it turns out that there's like 8,000 acre feet of groundwater that leaves the subbasin into the 180-foot aquifer subbasin. Depends on how you calculate it.
Well, here it says 4424.
So no, that's the average loss in storage. So that's how much we lose every year. So if you look at groundwater levels, they've been falling so much that we're losing 4,400 acre feet per year in the Monterey subbasin.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
I think so. I'm not quite sure why the loss in storage is different. You said the flow, the cross boundary flow was 8,000 acre feet per year, and I'm not quite
I'd
sure.
have to go back and look at the math because exactly how much it is.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, these numbers add up. So I'm okay with these, but the 8,000, I'm not quite sure how that fits in. But anyway, you can go ahead. This makes sense on this slide.
So I guess what I would alert you to is, even though CalAM's wells might not capture that water, the Monterey subbasin is going to lose that water in either case, because it's basically creating drawdowns that are drawing water across that boundary. So even though they may not capture it, it's a loss in storage to the Monterey subbasin. And I can tell you that right now we're in the process of doing a project for MCWD where we are trying to add through injection about 600 acre feet injection into the aquifer of recycled water. The estimated capital cost of that project is $15 million. These are not insignificant numbers to MCWD.
Okay. Does that conclude your summary?
Yes.
All right, thank you. And thank you for, I'll say, very efficiently summarizing, notwithstanding a few interruptions from me. Thank you for efficiently summarizing your slides. I do appreciate that. Okay, so we're almost to noon. I would like to talk about our schedule for this afternoon and tomorrow. Mr. Osias, I assume you're going to have some cross-examination questions. You or one of your colleagues. Can you give me a time estimate?
I can after lunch.
Okay, what can you now, roughly, or?
Not really. I need to confer with my experts.
Okay. So here is the situation. I do have a few family health care issues I have to address, and I apologize, but I'm the only person who can provide this assistance. So I have to leave today. We have to stop this proceeding today at 2 p.m. I think we will have time. Obviously, that means potentially we will have to have the cross-examination of these witnesses carry over into tomorrow, potentially. But I think we will have time. I'd sort of roughly figured we had for Dr. Trudell about half a day. So I think we can easily still finish tomorrow. But it does mean we're going to have to break it up. And I apologize for that, but there are these family considerations that have just come up at the last minute that I was not anticipating. And I just have to address. There's no one else here who can address them. So that is the plan. What I say is that, and obviously my staff and I may have a few questions as well, although I don't have as many as I did yesterday. This is all becoming a lot clearer now that we're into the second round of witnesses. So let's do this. Let's plan to come back at, I'm going to say 1 p.m. That'll give us 1 hour and 3 minutes for the 1 hour and 4 minutes for our lunch break. I will ask you, Mr. Osias, who is going to do the cross-ex? And it can be different attorneys for the 2 different witnesses if you want, but I do want it to be 1 attorney per witness. And what is your time estimate? And then we'll see where we go. But I definitely want to cover, do our work between 1 p.m. and 2 p.m. today. And then we will see where we are as far as tomorrow. But I do anticipate and expect we will be able to finish tomorrow, with assuming Dr. Trudell, same 45 minutes for slide summaries, and then some time for cross-examination, presumably shorter for him tomorrow than to the cross-ex of these 2 witnesses, because there's only 1 witness instead of 2. So are there any questions, or can we just resume at 1 p.m.?
Should I, in planning, presume you will have maybe 15 to 20 minutes of questions?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, Mr. Osias, I think the way things are, and it's a little disjointed, I think you should assume that I'm going to have you go first today, and then I will confer with my staff and we will ask our questions tomorrow. And I realize that's backwards from how we did it before, although frankly, I asked Dr. Kincaid a lot of questions during his presentation, so it's going to be a little different. So for planning purposes, assume you will have between 1 p.m. and 2 p.m. today, and potentially, if you need it, and I think there's good reason for it, some additional time tomorrow. And I am aware that Cal-Am is 1 party, where Marina Coast and City of Marina were 2 parties. I am aware of that distinction. So,
Okay, well, I'm glad you warned me, because I had thought my cross would be less for everything that you asked,
yeah,
like yesterday.
well, it's frankly, a lot of the reasons we had more questions yesterday was I had read Dr. Kincaid and Ms. Nelson's testimony, and that prompted some questions. And sort of, since we're coming to this different sequence, it's going to be a little different. So that's why. So yes, assume you're going to hit the mark at 1 p.m. and go until 2 p.m. today, and we'll go from there.
Thank you.
And just as a reminder, for this session, go ahead and log off, because we do start a new session, new recording in the afternoon. So log back on a couple of minutes before 1 p.m. and we'll start then. So thank you.